What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. Week 5 running back starts and sits. We'll be talking about every backfield today, looking at which running backs I would be starting and sitting. But before we do that, of course, have to do the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat was what defense has allowed the most fantasy points to the running back position. The answer is the Raiders, and Chase Broderick was the first to get that one right. Today's stat, among wide receivers with at least 20 targets on the season, who has the shallowest ADOT? All right, let's start the breakdown off with the Thursday night matchup between the Bucs and the Bears. The Bucs opened as 5.5-point road favorites, but the line has been bet a little bit in the Bears' favor. This is also tied for the lowest total game of the week at around 44 points. On the Bucs side, we have a bit of a mess. It might seem on the surface like Ronald Jones is just a slam dunk play after 20 carries, 9 targets last week. But he did have 2 drops, bringing his total to 3 on the year. And he did lose some snaps to Keyshawn Vaughn, even with Fournette out, then McCoy and Barner getting hurt. He still only played 64% of the snaps, and that wasn't because of a blowout. This game was close for basically the entire game. And he did lose 25% to Vaughn. There's definitely a chance that on Thursday night, we still see Jones operating as basically the featured back. Because if you're getting 20 carries, 9 targets, you're effectively the featured back. But there's a lot of other ways that it could play out. We could see some of these guys come back from injury. We could see Vaughn get increased snap share if they don't come back. And so I only trust Jones as a flex play this week, not a running back 1, not a running back 2. And then I don't really care who's activated or what the reports are with Vaughn. I feel like Jones is the only one I would trust in a lineup. Even if they bring back Fournette, and again, even if they say Vaughn's going to get expanded role, I think for this entire backfield, really, I'd rather just wait and see. There's so many running backs that they can use that unless they're just Jones is the guy, Jones is going to get all this work, and they deactivate some of these running backs that had injuries, then I trust Jones. But other than that, he's just a flex play, and I wouldn't do anyone else. On the Bears side, Montgomery played 85% of the snaps this last week, and he saw 6 targets, so he was the featured back. He didn't do a whole lot with that volume, but the Colts have also allowed the 3rd fewest fantasy points to running backs, while ranking 5th in rush defense DVOA, 4th in yards per carry, so not surprising at all that Montgomery didn't have a great game. Unfortunately, he is an underdog in this one, and the Bears are only projected to score around 19 points. And how are the Bucs at defending running backs? Well, they rank 2nd in rush defense DVOA, 2nd in yards per carry allowed. The massive snaps and all of this volume is going to make him flex viable, but he's kind of the same as Jones. I don't trust anyone else in this backfield, and they're probably going to get all the carries. So I think that if you have Dave Montgomery, if you don't have 2 or 3 other really solid options, you can play him because of the volume. Just remember that he is an underdog. They're not projected to score that many points. He hasn't performed that well, and it's a pretty difficult matchup. So don't be surprised if he doesn't perform all that well, and don't be super against benching him if you have better options. Next up, we've got the Bengals at the Ravens. The Ravens are massive home favorites in this one, and the total is really high, but most of those points are coming on the Baltimore side. For the Bengals, we saw Mixon finally explode last week. He played 83% of the snaps. He ran a ton of routes. He saw 6 targets. He is the featured back in Cincinnati, and he needs to be played every week at this point. Just don't expect that sort of performance again this week. He's a massive road dog against the Ravens team that ranks 3rd in rush defense DVOA, 7th in yards per carry allowed. He is still going to be in that low-end running back 1, high-end running back 2 range. But again, he's not going to perform 40 fantasy points every week. Don't be surprised if he doesn't have a great game this week. On the Ravens side, it's the same as it always is. These guys are just splitting 1/3 of the snaps. We should expect that for fantasy, Ingram is the most important, then Dobbins, then Gus. And it's really just going to be for any of them, do they score a touchdown? If your back doesn't score a touchdown and he's on the Ravens, he's not going to be viable in fantasy. I would prefer to not start any of these guys, but it would be how I just listed it. Ingram, then Dobbins, then Gus. But again, I prefer none of them. Panthers at Falcons is next up, and the Falcons opened as 3-point home favorites, but that has been bet in the Panthers' favor just a little bit. And the game has also seen its total rise to around 54 to 55 points. I would start both running backs in this game. You're absolutely starting Mike Davis. He is the featured back, especially with Bonifon going on IR, I believe, but he's at least out for this week. There's no one. I mean, Mike Davis is going to get a ton of touches against a Atlanta defense that has been decimated by injuries. Davis is a running back one this week, and you are playing him. I really don't care what other backs you have. As for Gurley, he is still seeing enough volume, and this is a good enough matchup to where I feel comfortable starting him, like I said, to start. But realize that he is still very touchdown dependent. If you watch that game, they're not scripting. I'm talking about the game that just happened. They're not scripting him any work in the receiving game. None. And if you watch really any game that's happened this year, he has a few targets, a few receptions, but these are coming on plays where he just comes out of the backfield. He's like the ninth read on the play, and it's just a 5-yard dump. That is all his targets are. None of these are screens. None of these are scripted. And so there's no upside there. He's only getting you maybe a point to a point and a half a game in the receiving game. And since he's probably not going to rush for like 150 yards, he needs to score. Now in this one, he has a very high touchdown probability because the game has a high total. He's on the favored team. And so I would be starting him. Just realize that it's basically only the matchup at this point. And if he has another good game, I'd sell him. Speaking of the matchup just a little bit more, the Panthers are a really nice team to target running backs against because they're a little bit of a run funnel. They allow the second most fantasy points per game to running backs, but the third fewest to quarterbacks. And so he had a good game last week. He should have a solid game this week. And so maybe if he does, it could be time to sell high on Gurley. Next up, we've got Raiders at the Chiefs, and Kansas City is nearly a 2-touchdown home favorites. And this is currently the second highest total game on the week, so there should be a lot of scoring in this one. Assuming that this game plays, given that they did face the Patriots on Monday night, from a fantasy perspective, it's one of the easiest games to go over. You're playing Josh Jacobs and Clyde Edwards-Helaire every single week, regardless of matchup. I have both of them ranked as top 6 running backs as of recording this, but no matter what I do to change the rankings throughout the week, they are both going to be running back ones, and they are both going to be players you need to be starting every week. Eagles at Steelers up next, and the Steelers are 7-point home favorites coming off their surprise bye, and this game is a 44-point total, which as of right now matches the Thursday night game for the lowest on the week. For the Eagles, Miles Sanders is being used as a feature back. He's averaging 17 carries, 6.3 targets per game since returning from his injury, and you just have to be playing running backs getting that sort of volume. I know this matchup is brutal. Touchdown underdog on the road, the Steelers rank first in both rush defense DVOA and yards per carry allowed. So when you also factor in that the Steelers are coming off their bye, they've had extra time to prepare for this one. I mean, it is very likely that Sanders doesn't have a great game. The problem is, like I just said, if you're getting 17 carries, 6 targets per game, we're expecting them to be trailing, and he is going to get receptions, and they don't have that much talent on offense that's healthy right now. We know Ertz looks like dust. We know Goddard is hurt. We know Jackson's hurt. Alshon's hurt. Rager's hurt. Like, literally everyone is injured, and so they have to lean on their best player, and their best player right now is Miles Sanders. And so I know the matchup's brutal. I have him in like 3 out of 4 leagues. I basically have to play him. There's one league where maybe I could bench him, but I'm playing him because he's going to get the volume. They have to lean on him. And I'm not expecting a lot, but you know what? He's going to get some receptions, so he'll have at least a nice floor. On the Steelers side, the matchup also is not very good for James Conner, but it's not nearly as bad as it is for Miles Sanders. Plus, he's on the favored team. He's on the team that's had more time to prepare, so the matchup is better for him. He's like a low-end 1 to a high-end running back 2. Benny Snell ceded the backup job to James Conner once Conner returned, so don't worry about Snell just like randomly taking over the workload. This is Conner's job right now. And then Anthony McFarland actually took some work away from Benny Snell as well, and he looked great in his week 3 debut. So if you're a Connor owner, I'd actually be a little bit more worried about McFarland than I would be with Snell. I am fine dropping Snell if you need to, and honestly, I don't really think there's a reason to own him right now. And then McFarland is not a bad stash. If you remember over the summer, I did talk a lot about how McFarland, they would like to use him more as a change of pace back. So I don't believe McFarland is a guy that is randomly one week just going to get like 17 carries and 6 targets and just overtake Connor. I still do think that their ideal split between these two is to use Anthony McFarland to make sure James Conner stays relatively healthy throughout the season, giving him in that like 7 to 10 carry range with a little bit of work in the receiving game. And that is still going to be enough volume to where he is like fine in the flex, not right now, but like I'm talking, in like a month or so, to where he would be fine in the flex and you'd still be starting Connor. But as of right now, I think you're starting him absolutely. Talking about James Conner there, and then you're not starting either Snell or McFarland unless you're in like a pretty deep league or something. Next up, we've got the Rams at the football team, and we have a quarterback change in this one. Kyle Allen will be replacing Dwayne Haskins as the starting quarterback for Washington. I did tweet out some stats comparing these two quarterbacks, and honestly, it just looks like a lateral move. Neither of these guys are good. Neither is the long-term answer at quarterback. In the short term, though, maybe this can be viewed as a slight positive to Gibson. We can't really know, and quarterback change always adds risk. But we do know that Kyle Allen loved to throw dump-offs last year, and so maybe Gibson sees a few more targets this week. We saw last week that Washington was actively trying to get Gibson the ball more in the receiving game. That was great to see because those targets are much more valuable. Remember what I said with Gurley. Gurley's targets are only going to turn into like 5, 6, 7 yards. But when you're scripting someone's screen passes or trying to get the ball into Gibson's hand, well, he's explosive enough to where those can turn into 60-yard touchdowns. Those can turn into massive plays like we saw last week. And so I'm very excited for the potential of Gibson down the line this season. It is not ideal being such a massive underdog, especially when you're on the team projected to score less than 19 points. But the Rams are a little bit of a run funnel. They rank 7th in pass defense DVOA, 28th in rush defense DVOA. So maybe Gibson can find a few lanes, and he really only needs one hole to make his entire day because he can bust off a touchdown from basically anywhere on the field. Because of the game environment, he is like a low-end running back too, someone that because of the current landscape of running back with all these injuries, I am fine playing, and I believe I will be starting him in one of the 2 leagues that have him, and maybe even both, honestly. I'd have to remember back. But I'm not afraid to start him. Tough matchup, but again, there's not that many running backs, and so if he's a low-end running back too, you can absolutely start him in the flex. On the Rams side, we thought Henderson had taken over the backfield, but then they decided to go back to Brown. It wasn't like, they went back to Brown, Henderson did nothing. I mean, the split was almost even. I think Brown had 1 more carry than him. But we really thought that Henderson looked good because he did look good. He had back-to-back 100-yard games. It seems like they were going to start using him a little more, so it's a little confusing why they went back to Brown. And with Akers kind of set to return this week, we're really just back to guessing. They're going to use a hot hand situation like they did talk about in the summer, and so that's just not good for fantasy. You basically have to guess who's going to start the game hot and get more of the carries, and when you add in a third running back, that's really difficult. So I would prefer to just bench all Rams running backs until somebody starts to get a consistent workload. Next up, we've got the Cardinals at the Jets. The Cardinals are touchdown road favorites, and this game has a fairly large 47-point total. On the Cardinals side, I went over in this week's trade video how I was concerned about Kenyon Drake. He's not getting very many high-value touches at all, and that does not seem to be a fluke. They like Chase Edmonds, and they're going to give him his touches, and they're going to use him when they get close to the end zone. And while this matchup will seem good on the surface, the Jets do have one of the better run defenses in the league, and I am okay benching Drake for the time being. Hopefully they start to give him more targets, more red zone looks, but until that happens, I am fine keeping him on the bench. I mentioned that Edmonds is getting more high-value touches, But his volume isn't quite high enough for us to really trust in our starting lineup right now. But he is someone that I would stash everywhere because he is insanely valuable and his role will be massive if Drake went down or if they just decide, you know what, we're just going to start featuring Edmonds over Drake, which could absolutely happen given how Drake has performed this season. On the Jets side, Bell is planning on returning this week, but you'll want to obviously get confirmation on that, and you'll want to get confirmation on what his role is going to be. He's the only one I'd even consider starting, and we're just going to have to see what gets reported. If he's out, I wouldn't start any Jets running back. If he's active, we're going to need to see what beat reporters are saying, what the team is saying. Is he on a snap count? And I'm just going to update the rankings later in the week to reflect exactly what that information is showing. I can't possibly know right now because there are really no reports on what his workload is going to be or even if he is returning, but I think this is the week that he will. Next up, we've got Jaguars at Texans. The Texans are 6.5-point home favorites in this game. Has a high 54-point total. For the Jaguars, James Robinson has turned into a weekly must start. Only Alvin Kamara has more receiving yards on the season among running backs than Robinson, and he ranks 8th in points per game. So given that the Texans rank 29th in rush defense DVOA, 32nd in yards per carry allowed, and have given up the 4th most fantasy points to running backs, yeah, you're starting Robinson anywhere that you have him this week. On the Texans side, we saw Duke Johnson return last week and play 38% of the snaps. David Johnson has played 81, 95, and 96% of the snaps while Duke was out, but then he dropped to 55% last week on his return. Part of that was likely due to game script. They fell behind and had to catch up, but the Texans are going to be behind a lot this season, and so it's not great that he lost that many snaps to Duke. The Jaguars got absolutely roasted by Joe Mixon last week, so we can't exactly compliment their run defense. And if you're thinking of starting David Johnson, I'd do it as a running back too, just given the projected game script. If you're like a touchdown favorite against a team that just got absolutely destroyed by a running back who was doing nothing all season, I'm going to be interested in you. But it'll be very important to break down again how these snaps are split, because we see what happens in a trailing game script. If the Texans are winning for a large portion of this game and they still don't give David Johnson like a huge snap share, then we're going to start to be concerned. But if they keep him in like that 65 to 70% range, assuming they win this game, I mean, this is just a projected game script, they could absolutely lose. But if they win, if they're ahead for a lot of the game and he gets like 70% of snaps, that will help us in being more confident in him moving forward. But again, I think like given the game script, running back 2 is what you're looking at here. Dolphins at 49ers is up next, and the 49ers are 8.5-point home favorites, and right now there is no total set for this game, but we shouldn't expect it to be too high. We don't know who the quarterback for the 49ers is going to be, but no matter who it is, it's not like this is going to be a 56, 57-point total. I just assume it's going to be roughly average. On the Dolphins side, Myles Gaskins is the only back you can consider, since he's really the only one seeing meaningful snaps. Unfortunately, the 49ers have allowed the fewest points per game to opposing running backs, and we all know the Dolphins don't exactly have the greatest offensive line. Given his high snap share and consistent role in the receiving game, I would be fine starting Gaskin as like a flex play. Just don't be surprised if he doesn't perform all that great, because again, he's a massive road underdog against a pretty solid run defense, and his offensive line is trash. But like I said, high snap share, gonna get the target, so he should be fine in the flex. On the 49ers side, keep an eye on Mostert's status. If he plays, then it's obviously gonna hurt the value of McKinnon. Assuming Mostert remains out, McKinnon is a high-end running back too. He played on 92% of the snaps in week 4 and would offer a lot of touchdown upside and a nice receiving floor given that he's playing Miami. But again, if Mostert is active, well, they're going to kind of split a lot of the workload. And then we're just going to really need to see how much they plan on using him, and I will adjust the rankings accordingly. Giants at Cowboys is up next, and Dallas is a massive 9.5-point home favorite, and the total is pretty high at 54 points. For the Giants, Freeman is the only one you can really start. Gallman and Dion Lewis have seen their snaps drop, and it's pretty clear that they want Freeman to be the guy. Fortunately for Freeman, he gets a matchup this week with, the Cowboys, who don't love playing defense. He might be a pretty big road dog, but, the Browns were road dogs last week, and then they proceeded to run for over 300 yards, 3 touchdowns on 7.7 yards per carry. Dallas now ranks 23rd in rush defense DVOA, 31st in yards per carry allowed. So Freeman is absolutely not a guarantee to produce in fantasy this week because it's Freeman. Like, we know that he's a little bit dust at this point, but I have him ranked as like a low end 2 to a flex play, and I think you can realistically start him given how bad the Cowboys defense is. On the Cowboys side, always start Zeke. It's as simple as that. Next up, we've got Colts at Browns, and the Colts opened as 2.5-point favorites, but that line has been shifting in the Browns' favor, and this total is fairly average. It's not that high, not that low, pretty mediocre one. On the Colts side, we know that Jonathan Taylor has been, I would say, okay in the past 2 weeks. Not that great, not what you've been expecting. But you always have to start him given that they want to feature the running back in this offense and given his talent level. For Hines, he's like a low-end flex play, but I would reserve that for deeper leagues. I don't think you're ever starting him in a 10 or 12-team league. As you move into 14 teams, and maybe if you add an extra bench spot, then it's okay. But 10 and 12-team leagues, we're keeping Hines on the bench. As for the Browns, this is why we hyped up Hunt so much over the summer. He was a great value, assuming Chubb stayed healthy, and he's a league winner if Chubb goes down. Well, Chubb went down, so congrats if you drafted Kareem Hunt. This is not a great matchup. The Colts rank 5th in rush defense DVOA, 4th in yards per carry allowed, but you just have to start Hunt every week that Chubb misses. I know the other running backs got a decent amount of work last week, but I would not trust any of them in a matchup like this. The Sunday night game is going to feature the Vikings at the Seahawks, and the Seahawks are 7-point home favorites, and this game has a massive 57.5-point over-under. This one's fairly simple. We are always starting Dalvin Cook and Chris Carson while they're healthy, especially in the highest total game of the week, and I wouldn't start any of their backups. The Monday night game is going to be Chargers at Saints, and the Saints are 8-point home favorites, and this one has a relatively high 50.5-point total. The Chargers will be without Eckler for a little bit, which means we've got Joshua Kelly and Justin Jackson seeing a boost in playing time. Kelly is our preferred option, but it is worth noting that Jackson was actually the backup before getting injured in week 1. Now, Kelly has been good given the opportunity. He wasn't great last week, but no one really was on that backfield. And so maybe he is the backup now. I haven't seen any sort of confirmation on that. I would not be surprised to see Jackson get more work than most people expect. And because of that, coupled with like a pretty difficult matchup against an elite Saints run defense, I only have Kelly as a low end 2 to a flex play, and I would prefer to keep Jackson on the bench because we just haven't seen him produce yet this season, and I don't really trust his workload because we don't know what it's going to be. But also consider that this team likes to run the ball, and so even though it's a tough matchup and we don't really know what the split's going to be, losing Eckler opens up a lot of touches, and given that Kelly was already receiving a good amount, I think you can trust him if you need to start him. Again, low end 2 to a flex play. On the Saints side, obviously start Kamara, and as for Latavius Murray, I would personally keep him on the bench. Last week was a good time to start him. It was a really bad Lions team. We knew they were going to score points, and so that was like an opportunity to start him. But this week is a little bit different. The Chargers have a much better run defense than the Lions. And remember that Latavius Murray had 5, 4, and 7 fantasy points in weeks 1 through 3 before exploding last week. He's extremely touchdown dependent, and while he's going to have a few weeks like he just had in week 4, it's probably not going to happen this week, especially if Michael Thomas is able to return. If Thomas is out again, then you can lean on him maybe in a deeper format. But if Thomas returns, then we know they're going to throw the ball a little bit more between the 20s. They're going to throw the ball a little bit more in the red zone. And so I would prefer to start someone other than Murray. The last 2 games of the week are Bills at Titans and Broncos at Patriots. Tough to say as of right now if these games are going to play or not. The Titans saw a new case on Wednesday, actually I think 2 new cases, And so they might not be able to play this week. They cannot return to practice as of right now. And then Gilmore tested positive for the Patriots. And so obviously pay attention here. Don't be starting players if the games get postponed into future weeks. We could see something like with the Patriots last week, gets moved to Monday. Maybe it gets moved to Tuesday. But we're just going to have to see. We don't know the future. Let's assume that the games are played, though. We need to know the status of Zach Moss. If he's out again, then we are starting Singletary. If he's active, then I would keep Moss on the bench in his first week back, and Singletary would be more of a flex play. And then the Titans side, just start Derrick Henry and no one else for the running backs. For the Broncos, the value of Melvin Gordon is going to depend on Lindsey. If Lindsey remains out, well, then Gordon's going to be a very strong play given that he's going to be the featured back. But it seems like Lindsey's going to return this week, and that would make Gordon much more of a flex play in a truly brutal matchup. And we don't really know as of right now if Locke's going to return. But if he doesn't, and they're going on the road to New England, that's really tough to start Gordon because, again, Lindsey was splitting the touches with Gordon before he got hurt. And so if you're splitting the touches in a brutal matchup, that's not good for anyone. So there's a possibility you could bench Gordon if Lindsey returns. But if he doesn't return, I think you have to play him. On the Patriots side, we've got that classic Patriots mess. Our boy Damian Harris had 100 rushing yards in his first game, but he also had 0 targets. And it's tough to know how many targets he'll get when Cam returns. It's tough to also know, is Cam returning this week? But hopefully he hasn't just taken over the Sony role, meaning that he's going to turn to Sony 2.0, getting like 15 carries and 0 targets, because that's really tough, because especially when Cam returns, Cam's going to take a lot of goal line carries. And so the touchdown volume goes down, or I guess the touchdown upside goes down. And so even though he's going to be very efficient on the ground because Cam makes other running backs more efficient, when you're getting like 15 for 70, it's like, cool, thanks for the 7 points. But if you're not getting targets, you're not valuable. And so I would still prefer to wait and see on Harris. I understand if you need to use Harris and White as flex plays, with White being preferable in a full PPR league. Harris, of course, better when you move away from full PPR. But by no means is any Patriots running back a player you need to force into lineups because there are just so many of them. So that's a breakdown of every backfield in week 5. If you want to see my exact rankings on all players, you can check that out at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. But that's the end of this one. Hope you all did enjoy. If you did, how about hitting that like button? And how about subscribing to the channel if you're new? Thanks for watching.